Welcome to Easter services at Christ Church. What a glorious day to be with family, be with our friends at church, and to celebrate the miracle that gave the world something new. Jesus broke out of the tomb on a Sunday, the first day of the week. And while the day of the week for Christmas and Independence Day is always changing, we can count on Easter being on a Sunday, the first day. I don't know about you, but after a long work week, I often find myself wishing we could tack on another day to the weekend. It's something that I heard the French do. What would it be like if we had an eighth day? Ancient Jewish and Christian tradition describe God as creating the world in 6 days and resting on the seventh. But what happened after that? The band Craven Melon said that's when God created sweet tea. Well, it turns out that Christian and Jewish thinkers have been pondering that question for some time. Ancient Jews celebrated special ceremonies like circumcision and extra Sabbaths on the eighth day. They didn't call it the first day of a new week. No, they called it the eighth day, pointing to something different. One of the earliest church fathers wrote that God said, "After I have set everything at rest, I will create the beginning of an eighth day, which is the beginning of another world." He then went on to explain, this is why we spend the eighth day in celebration, the day on which Jesus both arose from the dead and after appearing again, ascended into heaven. An eighth day, the dawn of something new. And the world could use something new, couldn't it? In the first half of the 19th century, the world was brought to its knees through a pandemic, 2 world wars, and a Great Depression. Now, that was over the span of 40 years. Within the past 2 years, we've gone through the first global pandemic in over 100. A superpower has invaded another country for the first time since World War II. And when we're facing inflation so bad, Tom Brady had to come out of retirement to pay for a tank of gas. We haven't seen the levels of pain and loss that was experienced during World War II or the Spanish flu. But within a short time, we've seen a lot. Our grandkids or great-grandkids may well ask us, what was it like the day everything shut down? What were they saying when Russia invaded Ukraine? Where were you the day that Will Smith slapped Chris Rock? It's all been a lot to process. And it's easy to look at recent events and conclude that history is repeating itself, that we're caught in a cycle of brokenness and hardship instead of steady progress to something better. And if only it stopped there, right? Some of us have gotten by without the news cycle having much of an impact on our lives, but perhaps you felt caught in your own cycle. A difficult season at work, one where you believe conditions are going to get better but never do. Maybe some of you feel stuck in an endless cycle with your spouse, tired of hearing that they won't spend all of their time at work, or they're tired of believing you'll one day feel appreciated for all that you do. Or maybe you're feeling trapped in a bad personal cycle, progress with some diet or against some addiction that keeps falling through. We could all use something new, couldn't we? Something new that's also something better. Something that's better for our friendships, better for the hurting, better for our marriages, better for our kids and grandkids, better for our bottom lines, better for our bodies, better for our souls, better for the world. Something that breaks the cycle of bad. But the kind of new that Jesus promised with his resurrection is kind of hard to comprehend, isn't it? Have you ever tried to picture a world without the pain of conflict, loneliness, war, hatred, sadness? I have to admit, sometimes when my mind goes there, it looks a little cartoonish. It's so far from what I know and what I see every day. What if better than we could possibly imagine was different than anything we've ever known? If it was offered to us, would we take that step? Would you? I'm not sure that the women who went to visit Jesus' grave that morning knew the answer to that question. when they came face to face with it on that Sunday morning, the 8th day. The writer Matthew tells us it was dawn of the first week. Perhaps the women got up early to anoint the body of Jesus, hoping that the guards wouldn't be there. Everyone was still on edge after the events of the past few days. Jesus had been executed after an unfair trial. Only days earlier, he entered the city with fanfare. People were crying, "Hosanna," and celebrating him like a king. But accusations were made. False accusations were made. The leadership quickly turned the crowds against him. He was beaten, mocked, led to the cross, and left to die. Jesus' disciples had all but disappeared. They had gone into hiding. Were they next? But Mary and another woman Matthew calls the other Mary, possibly Jesus' mother, gathered up enough courage to go to the tomb that day to pay respects. They just had to. Sometimes duty is enough to pull us into precarious circumstances, if only for a moment. So after a Sabbath wait that seemed like forever, two grieving souls made their way into a rock outcropping outside of the city early Sunday morning. They set out to see the body for themselves. But there was no body where the women were going that day. Matthew tells us, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid." Now, the way that Matthew tells the story, it appears that the angel removes the stone not to let the body of Jesus out, but to show the women that the body isn't there. The body is already gone. Everyone's afraid. Well, that's typically what happened when they saw angels back then. But the guards, they're really afraid. Matthew appreciates the irony of the scene, telling us that the only thing that looks dead at the tomb are the guards sent to keep people from tampering with it. It's hard to blame them. A heavenly figure comes down from the sky with clothes so white they would put your grandma's washing skills to shame. He had an appearance like lightning, Matthew tells us. And although one man, Joseph of Arimathea, was able to roll the stone in place by himself in normal fashion, when the angel pushed it aside, it caused the ground to shake. He plops himself on the top of the rock as a way to show victory over it. And then he looks at the women and says, "Now don't freak out." You got to love how the angel doesn't say that to the guards, who are probably pressed against the wall that the tomb had been carved into. No, you guys freak out. It's perfectly okay for you to freak out. But to the women, he says something different. It wasn't an uncommon way for angels to introduce themselves. Do not be afraid. But this encounter wasn't typical, and chances are the angel's statement might play a bigger part of the story. Look how Matthew continues. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. The memories and the emotions of what Jesus predicted about his resurrection flooded back. At the time, it must have felt too good to be true. Was Jesus speaking metaphorically, as he did sometimes? But now, after all that they had been through, perhaps it felt too good not to be true. And just like that, reality warped. Assumptions and beliefs they had firmly held about the past, present, and future suddenly shifted, spun, and fit together in brand new ways. Matthew will tell us later that some of the men continued to doubt once they encountered the risen Jesus. Matthew shares no hint of doubt with these women. They're filled with joy. But did you notice? Despite the angel's encouragement, they are still afraid. What a strange combination, fear and joy. Maybe some of you have experienced that with the offer of a new job or the arrival of a new child. We can both anticipate something good with gladness and fear it greatly because of all the unknowns. But this was at another level. Resurrection? Yes, Sabbath was over and Sunday had come, the first day of the week. But this wasn't just the first day of the week, was it? It was the 8th day. It was the dawn of something entirely new, something no one had ever seen before. If Jesus had been raised, then what did it mean for them and the rest of humanity? They couldn't have understood it all at the time. But the new creation was in front of them. Would they have the courage to take a step forward? I remember sitting in the audience, surrounded by adults, waiting for my turn to speak. The man at the podium was the owner of a multi-million-dollar dog food company that got its start from a website. This was the era of Web 1.0. E-commerce was just starting to get popular. Amazon was still mostly selling books. Small business owners from my community leaned in with interest to hear about the man's success and gather any tips they could to improve their own businesses. He told them about the difficulties of getting started and some of his own life lessons along the way. I don't remember many of the details, but I'll never forget one point of advice he shared. You don't want to have your nephew or your kid put a website together for you. Well, at the time, I was working for one of the leaders in our community, a respected lawyer and member of the school board. He was the one who invited me to speak. He turned his head to see my reaction. I was up next to talk about how I'd put a website together for my dad's business. Well, what looked like an impossible situation was something else. I made a couple of quick adjustments to my introduction and got up after the dog food guy received his applause. I want to thank Mr. Kruger for what he shared, I began, and I can understand where he's coming from. After what you heard, I know it's going to sound a little funny hearing from a kid who put together a website for his dad. But maybe some of you are just getting started and can't afford to put a lot of money into a website. I'm here to tell you that anyone can do it. Well, the truth is, Mr. Kruger was kind of right. To be honest, the website I put together looked a little like someone's 18-year-old son did it. But the man handed me a softball, and I hit it as hard as I could. And it worked. I didn't know it at the time, but the chief of staff of our U.S. congressman was sitting in the audience that day. He came up to me afterward and asked me if I'd be open to becoming an intern under the congressman. He must have thought that I sounded like a politician. Whoa, I thought to myself. My imagination immediately took off. What an opportunity, and what kind of doors could that open up for me? I wanted to say yes, but the truth is I didn't know how. I was planning on going to college. That's what everyone else was doing. The idea of going a non-traditional route, as promising as that could be, was just too scary to me. So I stuck with plan A. That seemed to be the safest sort of thing, to stick with what I knew. Is that what the women were feeling when they walked away from the angel at the tomb? An overwhelming excitement that Jesus was alive, that all those ideas about the resurrection were true, that they were on the cusp of a new reality, the 8th day of creation, but also a fear of the unknown, a desire to stay with what was familiar, an unwillingness to risk even at the greatest possible outcome. In 1979, psychologists came up with something called prospect theory, which describes how people making choices involving risks. The theory argues that people are drawn to certainties and will take greater risks to avoid losses than to achieve gains. It's why people who have no statistical need for car insurance pay for it anyway. It's why if a person is told they have a 100% chance of receiving $900 or a 98% chance of receiving $1,000, they'll take the $900 almost every time. We tend to stick with what's right in front of us, what we know, instead of taking risks to achieve something altogether greater. But as the women part ways with the angel, their story, as recorded by Matthew, takes an important turn. Matthew was an apostle of Jesus, but he wasn't the first to write about Jesus. Most scholars believe that it's actually Mark who wrote first. Matthew relied on Mark's version of the story to tell his own. But there's something strange about Mark's version of this story. After the women encounter the angel at the empty tomb and hear the news that Jesus is risen, the angel tells them to share the good news with the disciples. But they run off afraid and say nothing because of their fear. And that's where Mark's story comes to an abrupt, uncomfortable, and in my opinion, intentional halt, forcing us to wrestle with unanswered questions about the women and perhaps ourselves. Well, Matthew, however, continues. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Bowing down at someone's feet was a way of paying homage, something that was done to prestigious figures like kings in that day. Jesus had crossed the boundary of life and death. He's taken on a new status. He is the firstborn from among the dead. Their response is appropriate. But it also tells us something more. You don't grasp the feet of ghosts. This is something that took place in time and history. A real stone was rolled back. You could press against it and feel its weight. The people in Jerusalem could visit an empty tomb, step inside and occupy its space. The disciples touched the risen Jesus. They could feel his calloused feet. They could see the evidence of his death in the scars his hands carried. They could hear the warmth of his voice calling them to him. Notice that Jesus repeats the words of the angel, "Do not be afraid." You could make the case that is one of the most obvious things he could say. It's one thing encountering a stranger who looks like he left his clothes in the washing machine too long. It's another thing running into a person who you just watched die. But with a strong emphasis on fear in this passage, I can't help but wonder if there is something more here. Was this personal encounter with the risen Jesus what the women needed to overcome their fear of the familiar and allow their joy for new possibility to flourish? Similarly, we too may have mixed feelings about the message of Easter. Can the perfect of tomorrow really be true when we are so often confronted with what's wrong today? And can that joy transform our present circumstances? Bring joy in our work, in our relationships, in our parenting? It turns out that Jesus' invitation is not just a word for the women, it's a word for us. Do not be afraid. We may have mixed feelings around the Easter message too, but encountering Christ personally can change all of that. That's one of the reasons I love what we've been able to offer the past few months with our Alpha course, which is given people a space to wrestle with some of the hard questions of faith and find Christ lead them in the midst of those questions. Well, that's also why I'm looking forward to our marriage class in May, because it demonstrates how the joy of the perfect can come alive even in imperfect marriages when we encounter Jesus personally. And if you want to liven up your marriage, strengthen some of its weaknesses, or simply prepare for that possible next season of life, we'd love to have you join us for that. Something new has come. Something that will bring perfection tomorrow and can bring better today. You know, every fiber of our beings might steer us from the unknown, but Jesus has come to lead us there. He encounters us halfway. We are not alone, and God wants us to live with him. If he was raised, we'll be raised. And Jesus gives us courage by meeting us and leading us there. Scott and Jen Field, who have been a part of Christ Church for the past 20 years, found that out when they looked at their marriage and saw the writing on the wall. I had the chance to sit down with them recently to hear more about it.
So we had been married about 9 years, and we had just come to Nashua. We were living in Massachusetts at the time. We had just been through a really bad real estate situation. We lost a lot of money, a lot of belongings. So we came to Nashua to kind of regroup. I just felt really alone in the marriage. I felt like it wasn't working and I didn't know how to fix it. And now the kids were growing up, so now they were going to start noticing things. And I thought, I don't want to be a part of this. This isn't what I want. This isn't what I signed up for. But then I thought, if I'm taking my kids away from their father, I better make sure that this is the right thing to do. So going to Nashua Baptist Church, just into this area, when I was contemplating leaving him, I got to know people at the church. I thought, these people are really nice. And we attended Sunday school. I didn't know what Sunday school was. I never went as a kid. I'm like, oh, all these people get to know you and they pray for you and, you know, you talk about good things and help each other. And so I just simply asked the Sunday school to pray. Wanted to include Scott in a lot of activities, but he wouldn't come. I went with the kids all by myself for a long time, but there was one activity that Nashua Baptist Church had, and that was Back to Bethlehem.
It was about the story of Jesus, but it was very well done, something that I thought was entertaining. And but the thing I noticed is they had a lot, these were all volunteers, and it took like the whole church. And they were all having fun, which was out of my narrative in my head of what it was like to be a Christian, that it wasn't fun, that it was drudgery. And one of them was a book by R.C. Sproul called If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists? And it just struck me. I said, I have to read this book. This is going through a verse from Romans 1:28, which basically says, those who thought it was not worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, God would just cast them adrift. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be cast adrift. It was a lot of turmoil for me. I remember driving to work. I remember just crying on the way up there, most of the way, as I was struggling with who I've been and this concept of God that I had so much trouble moving towards, because I was just so set in my mind that for so many years that God didn't exist. I don't know, maybe if you grew up in a church, it's hard to understand just how difficult it was to turn away from a completely polar opposite way of thinking for a lifetime. Because this was late in my life. I was almost 40 when this was happening. And that resulted in this, during the revival, if I have so much emotion, I would have to stand and hold on to the pew, and I would just be shaking and holding the hymnal in one hand until the last night of the revival, when I stood up, and almost as soon as I stood up, my normal position, hold on to the front pew and holding on to the hymnal, I had to go up. If I didn't go up, I think I'd explode. I just had reached that point, and I pulled the hymnal, put it down, and I went up. And with Pastor Ellis, I accepted Jesus as my Savior and committed my life to Him. God was working on me the whole time. It wasn't like that was a switch that turned there. He's bigger than that. He was working on my self-centeredness and my struggles with addiction. And I was able to see people. I was able to see Jen breaking, through my self-centeredness, that who she is, and I was able to love her differently than before.
It affected me that, wow, he really does love me. He loves me that much. He really loves me that much. Like with all my flaws, and I get upset and talkative or whatever, but he just loves me through that. And I think, well, you know what? God's like that too. I can mess up, but he still loves me. He's not going to turn his back on me. I can show him every side, and he still accepts me. God is in the process of transforming, and he's there with us through the bad just as well as the good. And he takes us further, and he helps us deal with difficult situations. We can pray about things.
Yeah, we're able to share more, laugh more, work together.
There's nothing we can do to separate us from Jesus. You know, there's nothing that he could do. There's nothing I can do, because we can beat ourselves up that we're not good enough. I shouldn't have done it that way. But there is nothing that can separate us. And then that conviction that he can give you, it's all done in love, without any shame, with dignity. He never lets you stay defeated.
So, what about you? Is there a part of your life that Jesus wants to enter into and transform? Maybe like Scott and Jen, there have been times you haven't been able to see a way forward in your marriage. Could God be inviting you to experience the power of the resurrection as a couple, to enjoy not the kind of marriage you envisioned, but maybe something better? How could God transform your parenting, or your grandparenting, your work life, your personal life into something that will press on into eternity? Is Jesus inviting you to allow yourself to belong to something different? And for those of you who might be feeling this Jesus thing out for the first time, what kind of adventure could God be building for you on the other side? It may not be anything like you've ever known, but once you enter, is it possible that there is a joy so powerful you'll never want to turn back? How will you respond to this news of something new? Will you let fear keep you from stepping into it? Or will you follow the joy you are feeling now to something new and better? In Jesus, God entered into our world and into our lives to redeem them and invite us to experience something new. On the 8th day, he is casting a vision for a seemingly impossible future made possible by the resurrection. And he wants us to come along for the journey. Jesus, our forerunner, who has entered death, broke death, and came out on the other side, has made that journey. And he has returned to be our strength, our encouragement, and guide as we press on toward the other side.